Hello and welcome to the program. Today we're discussing the outcomes of the presidential elections in Ukraine, and to talk more about this, we're joined in the studio today by Julia Osmolovska. She's international politics expert and executive director at the Institute of Negotiations. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Very nice.
So the big news today, the preliminary results of the election. So Volodymyr Zelensky has won the first round of Ukraine's presidential election with 30.4% of the vote, ahead of Petro Poroshenko with 17.8% of the vote. How do you explain the rise of Zelensky? Is it the face of a new anti-establishment phenomenon or something else?
I wouldn't call it a new establishment phenomenon, because the critic that we hear about Volodymyr Zelensky is that he has no practical experience as a political figure, and therefore we can't be talking about the new establishment in politics first. And then the question comes about his team, his experts and people who can be nominated for different governmental positions. This is also an issue for the time being. So we would rather stick to the position that his sudden rise in electorate preferences is explained by the general protest against the current elite, the existing elite, and not just the current president Poroshenko and his circles, but also his potential rivals like Yulia Tymoshenko. So it's like about the protest against the existing system of governments in Ukraine, which existed for last 27 years.
So you would say that this vote is basically a protest vote, not necessarily for Zelensky, but against certain system.
Yeah, I would definitely stick to this position, because, as I mentioned, there are so many critics about his potential contribution to the governance of the country, which raise the questions for the time being, especially among the expert community. Therefore, let's see that this version of his sudden rise is more appropriate. I think the protests votes.
Now we're going to have a live from the headquarters of President Petro Poroshenko. Our correspondent Julia Boshko is in his headquarters of incumbent President Petro Poroshenko. Now she joins us now. And so, what's been the reaction of the front runner so far?
President Petro Poroshenko thanks the voters for their support in round first of the presidential elections. He stated that Ukrainians had, quote, thwarted the Russian scenario because the Kremlin didn't want to see the incumbent president in the second round of the election. Petro Poroshenko is hopeful that his support level will see a significant increase before round second, which has taken place on April 21st. The candidate said that this was a European democratic election with fewer violations than in 2014. Petro Poroshenko's headquarters is set to announce the results of their parallel vote count at 8 a.m. Back to you, Alex.
Well, thank you, Yulia, and she was from the headquarters of President Petro Poroshenko. Now, one of the the tough reaction was Yulia Tymoshenko's one, and she claims that she was actually the second in those polls. Now, the results are not final, and the difference between Mr. Poroshenko, 17% and 14%, are not completely final. Is there like a certain margin of error that would allow Tymoshenko to claim that second place here?
Well, we should wait first for official results of the Commission, which counts the votes, not just the exit polls. As we know, that exit polls sometimes can be easily manipulated first, and second, those who were questioned about their choice could probably also were not so sincere of saying whom actually they vote for. So therefore, and also given the margin that you just mentioned, like 3%, this is already quite narrow margin for Mrs. Tymoshenko to question the results. So a lot will depend on actual the parallel counting of votes presented by Mrs. Tymoshenko and by some other independent sources, and then we should seek, definitely, I think that she will be questioning these results, and also, which is quite surprising given the results he got, the reaction of Mr. Boyko, who also claims that the official counting of votes could deliver him second position, and he could be second for the next round of presidential elections.
Quite a bold claim here. So they both would have to present evidence there.
Yes,
so
yes, quite bold. But Mrs. Tymoshenko, if she has just the margin of 3%, then Mr. Boyko has a margin of 10%.
Yeah.
So it would be quite difficult for him to justify that the results were in his favor.
Now, in these margin, some could claim, because there has been international observers coming for the elections, and we're going to see a sujet soon about it. But these margins of error and these observers didn't stop violations, a certain number of violations, 1,600 violations in the election. So the presence of OSCE observers, of international observers, as I said before, didn't stop those violations to happen. How come it can still happen under the eyes of international observers?
Well, violations could happen in any elections, because sometimes they could be just technical omissions or something like that. The question is about size and scale. So in this context, we also have to bear in mind that among 30,000 of different electorate pools, we had just around 2,000 of international observers present. So it would be quite difficult for them to be in one place for the whole process of election and to justify whether there was some malfunctions or not. First. And then I would definitely refer to the official reaction of the Minister of Interior regarding these violations. They said that, yes, violations happened. They were not on such a drastic scale, which would question the legitimacy of this electorate process.
So you would say that it's a progress anyways, like compared to other elections?
Yeah, it is in progress, but my guess is that international observers in general would say that the elections were conducted in free and fair manner, and no severe significant violations had been observed.
Now, one of the issue raised by this election is the voting of persons living in war-torn Donbass and the difficulties for them to vote. Now we have another topic on how these inhabitants in the Luhansk region, and how the Ukrainian military helped the inhabitants of the Luhansk region to basically vote and have their vote counted here.
Serhiy has been on the front line for more than 3 months. His wife and daughter are waiting for him at home.
Just yesterday, I returned from my vacation, just in time for the election to cast my vote. Today, Ukraine's destiny will be decided. The future of our country depends on our choice. I want my daughter to live in a prosperous country without war.
Special polling stations have been set up to ensure that servicemen and women on the front line will be able to vote. The troops take turns going to vote, while others take up their positions on the front line. Just this morning, Russian-led forces attacked Ukrainian positions using heavy machine guns.
Even though the militants tried to provoke us in the morning, we found time to turn up and cast our votes. Something needs to change in Ukraine, and we must work every day to make that change. It will take not days, but years. I believe our choice will make a difference, and the country will become a better place.
In my company, the mood is very patriotic. The people came here for a reason. They realized that this is important to defend the country not only from the enemy in the east, but also from internal enemies.
This is a field polling station for 400 voters. There are no constant monitors, but mobile monitoring groups visit from time to time to observe for a few hours before moving to the next station.
From this day, I expect good mood and pleasant weather. I'm positive there will be no grave violations at our electoral district.
Aside from these special polling tents, the military can vote at regular polling stations in the nearby town of Popasna.
I came alone, but my mother voted at home. She's bedridden, so people came to her. They came and she voted as she found necessary. I vote for peace and stability for our country.
With more than 2,000 citizens registered, this is one of the Popasna's largest polling stations.
Hopefully more than 50% will vote.
There are 56 polling stations in the Popasna county of the Luhansk region. 5 of them are military field stations and 2 are hospital ones. Reported by Anastasia Volkova, UATV.
So now, would you say that that kind of structure, let's say, built by the militaries, is enough for the voters in these war-torn regions to vote?
I wouldn't think that the assistance that might be provided by military would be enough for all the voters who would wish to vote, to travel without significant complications and to give execute their right to vote. We know that around 5,000 of those who wanted to vote were able to travel from non-controlled territories to Ukraine and to execute their voting rights. But we also know that more than 1 million of inhabitants of these regions are deprived from actual voting. Not in legal terms. In legal terms, they can travel if they wish, but in physical terms, you understand that it could be quite difficult for the people, especially for the elderly. So, therefore, in this case, some of the experts tend to think that this is underrepresented percentage of those who wanted to vote in Donetsk and Lugansk regions.
Yes, because there is this issue of checkpoints which are really long to travel. To cross, sorry. There is this issue, the issue of money also, because they can't necessarily afford to go to the other side and stay longer on the other side just for a vote. Is there any other ways for these citizens not to feel like second-class citizens in the matter of being represented in this vote?
I think that in any case they would feel themselves as a second class, and we have to admit this truth and to understand it, because for the whole period of conflict with Russia and this limited access to non-controlled territories, and for those people to execute properly their rights as Ukrainian citizens, there always have been a criticism about them feeling themselves as a second-class people and the necessity of winning their minds from Ukrainian government, but this is a very challenging task, and I don't see that the situation has been improved, and this opportunity to participate in presidential elections also proved that the challenge is still there, and not all, or if I say just minor or a tiny amount of Ukrainian citizens from these territories were able to vote.
Now, speaking about this topic, we have another sujet about IDPs and how they went to the polls. Let's watch it.
On May 25, 2014, Olha wasn't able to cast a vote in that year's presidential election. A polling station never opened where she lived. In 2014, only a few polling stations across the Donbass were opened. Some even risked their lives to vote.
We couldn't vote because there were no polling stations. At that time, the safety of the election committee members and of people in general was, so to say, more important than to vote for someone. It was simply impossible.
Now, Olha is a Kiev resident and registered to vote early. This is a significant moment for her.
It's very pleasant when you can once again use your right to vote in the presidential election. We are not only choosing our fate today, but the fate of our children.
Olha is worried about the second round of voting. According to the law, the Central Election Committee must announce the results of the first round no later than the 10th of April. After this, Olha will need to register once again. With the second round of the presidential elections being held on April 15th, Olha says there might not be enough time to sort everything out.
There are only 5 days to change my voting address after the day when the first round's results are announced. I won't have this possibility. I will have to change our voting address again.
The Ukrainian Parliament recently passed a law allowing the internally displaced to vote according to their current address, regardless of their address of registration. Reported by Inessa Zanina, UATV.
Now, do you see that kind of thing as a progress since, let's say, 2014 and other kind of elections? Do you see that kind of structure as progress now?
The situation has been improved, definitely, and IDPs have more opportunity to vote in comparison to those who still live in non-controlled territories. This is obvious. But in terms of general chaos with all this bureaucracy and technicalities about executing the right for votes, there is still a bit of a mess, and I would say that situation is not perfect. Therefore, let's say it is much better, and it is good that a part of IDPs can claim that they were lucky to have the right and execute it, but I don't think that this is 100% of IDPs in total.
So these voters, maybe IDPs, voters from Luhansk, will yet face another challenge, not only for the presidential election, which was already quite hard for them to vote. It's going to be the parliamentary election, which is the next big thing. How important will it be, and will it be a real game changer here, whoever is voted president here?
Yeah, it will be very important, given the fact that, according to some prognosis, the complete structure of parliaments could be changed, and new parties will take more seats, and probably some of the traditional parties will be ruled out from the new composition. But a lot will depend on the proper electorate law, which would enable to provide these parliamentary elections with full-fledged access to all who would like to vote, ranging from ADPs, from people from Crimea, and people from Donetsk and Lugansk non-controlled territories. We know that political preferences of these people would be leaning towards those parties which defend the case for negotiating with Russia and seeking for some solutions, peaceful solutions. Therefore, we could assume that this is potential electorate of the current opposition bloc and Yuri Boyko and his party. Therefore, it's not probably in the interest of the current political government to enable fair elections and fair votes of this part of territories. Therefore, it would be really crucial to see whether the parliament in its existing form will be able to prepare properly this electorate for parliamentary elections.
Yeah, because the parliament will face a dilemma here, like being completely honest and fair for what people would like to vote, or face maybe like I wouldn't say an explosion, but kind of a completely change of structure here.
Yes, but the problem is that political parties tend to manipulate the public opinion, and they will always find justification for their actions or inability to pass this draft law or that draft law, referring either to severe opposition from some political forces in the parliaments or very bulky bureaucratic procedures or some other excuses. So I think everything will depend greatly on political will. And they mentioned the motivation for the current political government of Ukraine, probably not to let these protest voters, if we wish to label them so, to have access and vote in order to bring the opposition party in more power percentage in the new parliament. But let's wait and see how the opposition bloc and this party would defend their rights and would defend the rights of their potential electorate to participate in this process and actually to deliver them political gains.
Yeah, because for the viewers to understand that is in the Ukrainian constitution and the Ukrainian politics, the parliament is actually quite important into the political game, maybe more than in other countries. What's your stance on that? Can you shed light a little bit on that system?
Yes, I think that despite who will win the second turn of presidential elections, there will be very challenging task of the new president to find the common ground and understanding with the parliament in its existing form and with the new parliament from autumn this year. So definitely I would anticipate that political forces of Mrs. Tymoshenko, of Mr. Boyko and some others would be competing with the president, whoever he will be, because we know potential forerunners for that. And if we're talking about Mr. Zelensky, he doesn't have a political party at all. So for him it will be the most crucial first 4 months before the parliamentary elections, how he will be able to find an understanding with the parliament. And also, let us not forget that Ukraine is parliamentary presidential republic. So I would also foresee that in case Mrs. Tymoshenko fails in presidential elections, she will be actively defending the case for stronger role of parliament, limited role of president, and more vast competences of the prime minister, and she will be looking for obtaining that position.
Isn't there then a risk that the reforms could be blocked, basically just for the sake of it, because, you know, for political games, and that reforms which are needed, anti-corruption reforms, certain reform asked by the IMF, could be blocked because the opposition just don't want them to pass?
I wouldn't say that the reforms will be blocked. The reforms will be given second priority in this case. And as I say, there could be a very fair justification why the parliament is not able to proceed with reforms within this period. So everybody has been looking for presidential elections to see whether we could see some changes in our conflict relations with Russia. Everybody is still looking for parliamentary elections to see whether there could be some changes in internal political governance in the country. But in terms of reforms, at least officially, we know that all the candidates, at least the favorites of the presidential race, they had been declaring that they're in favor of continuing reforms, going ahead with reforms, and even Mr. Zelensky. So, but every much will depend on who he will represent his core team for reformers.
Now, it's not the program of this candidate is not only about the reforms, and there's also in Crimea is also on the table, Donbass also on the table. I propose to watch a topic about how Crimean voters finally voted and then managed to vote in Ukraine.
Crimean residents who refuse to accept Russian citizenship have crossed the checkpoint Kalanchak between the peninsula annexed by Russia and mainland Ukraine to cast their votes at the presidential election.
Usually 4 passport control booths work here at Kalanchak checkpoint, and today we have 10 so that all the citizens from temporarily occupied Crimea who wish to vote can do so in mainland Ukraine. Also, we increased the number of servicemen conducting vehicle control.
Buses organized by Ukraine's local administration in southern Kherson region took voters to the polling station. One voter who crossed the border by foot and said residents who kept Ukrainian citizenship after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 do not support a particular candidate. According to him, people are largely influenced by Russian propaganda.
We do not support anyone as a group, so some were about to go, some couldn't make it. That is why someone will vote for the opposition bloc, others for someone else. Russian TV is not the best advisor.
It was reported that 58 voters from Crimea registered at the polling station, and 33 of them already cast their ballots by midday. Some of them came from Alushta, Sevastopol, and Simferopol.
Now, as we said before, Crimea and Donbass are on the table in the programs of each candidate. Let's choose the 3 frontrunners. What their differences and similarities on the matter of this topic, this really hot topic in Crimea and Donbass?
Yes, the similarity is one and general, which is no clear clue how they would aim to succeed in getting back Crimea under Ukraine's control. So nobody is speaking in details about this particular mechanism. All of them say that Crimea is obviously Ukrainian territory, and they will be looking for having it back. But how this they're going to manage? So this is still the question. So with Donetsk and Lugansk, there is a tiny difference, I would say. We know the clear-cut strategy of our president, not to give any compromise to Russia, upgrade the Western support, and with their assistance to force Russia to give up from Crimea and from Donetsk and Lugansk. Whereas Mrs. Tymoshenko is concerned, she is more leaning towards the Budapest format of negotiations. However, to my mind, as a former diplomat, this is not very well thought and properly analyzed approach, because we know that the Budapest format didn't come into reality before, because United States and United Kingdom were a bit reluctant to enter this format, because the suggestion was offered to them by the German Chancellor at the very beginning, and they just ignored it. And then also we had some comments from the representatives of the British government saying that they've conducted some negotiations on this issue, which is actually means that they executed their obligations under this memorandum. And Mr. Zelensky is less clear about how he is going to settle this issue with Russia, how he is going to conduct negotiations and seeking for some solutions. He's also talking about gaining more support from the Western countries, started to talk with Russia, but with the support of West. But to my mind, this is also not thoroughly thought approach, which should be clarified further. And to my mind, very important would be a debate between the potential candidates for the presidential position before the second round, because a lot of people would like to listen to the candidates, to their programs, to their vision, especially on these hot topics as we've just been discussing.
Which brings me to my next question, the general attitude of each candidates towards Russia. Certain candidates are more, let's say, willing to compromise than others. How is it possible, and how, like, once and again, what's the difference for each candidate here towards this relation with Russia?
Yeah, we have to understand for ourselves the word of compromise. Compromise, it doesn't mean that you're giving up the national interest of Ukraine. Compromise means that you find a balance and try to understand what Russians want and clearly state what you want, where are the red lines, and to seek where they could be negotiable. So this is approach which doesn't present the potential negotiator as a trait of Ukrainian interests. But it is quite clear that with the current president, the personal dislike and a lot of mutual offenses that had been made during the last 5 years with regard to Russian side completely blocks him from any possibility of entering into any substantial bilateral talks with Russia, possibly with some observation status of international observers and important global players. For the other candidates, either Tymoshenko or Zelensky, this is more favorable because we don't know. Russia probably would like to listen to them, what they would like to say. And then everything would depend on proficiency of diplomatic team of both candidates, how they will be able to conduct and channel these negotiations. Which
brings me to a sort of a reverse question here. Which candidates would Russia prefer, in your opinion?
In my opinion, they would definitely be sympathetic towards those people who would express their willingness to seek the way out of the conflict and to listen to Russian side and try to find a common ground and understanding. Any candidate which could present this position would be considered from Russian side with interest. However, my personal opinion that for Russian political elite right now, all this turmoil in Ukraine, further turbulence, internal political turbulence, which would be weakening Ukraine, both politically and economically, plays very well in hands for Russians. So they're not interested in somebody who could manage the country and lead it proper European way. So therefore, I think that for them, none of these candidates are sort of a preferred option.
Now, that's for the eastern neighbor. Let's talk now about the western neighbors. What is the perception of the West about, well, now about Petro Poroshenko, about Zelensky, and about Yulia Tymoshenko? Tymoshenko has been in the game since long now. What's the general perception here?
Well, I think that the best comment that I've heard about the Western attitude towards these three figures was presented in Reuters, referring to some unofficial comments of diplomats which are posted in Ukraine or in Brussels, saying that we know what to expect from Mr. Poroshenko. We think we might know what we can expect from Mrs. Tymoshenko, but we don't know completely what to expect from Mr. Zelensky. And this is the actual, I think, perception of what's happening. Officially, politically, according to diplomatic culture, no single country would express openly its preferential stance towards any of the candidates. They will work with the result that has been achieved, and this should be a democratic choice of Ukrainian people who voted for this or that president. So in this sense, they still keep neutrality, and actually, which is very optimistic for me, their comments on the eve of the first round of elections, when they say that we don't know who might be the favorite of this presidential race, and that means that Ukraine is a real democratic country, because and no result is predetermined from the beginning.
Well, thank you for this overview. It was a pleasure to have you in the studio today to talk about the outcome of the elections. That was Julia Osmolovska, international politics expert and executive director at the Institute of Negotiation. Thank you for watching the program, and stay tuned for the rest.